And before we begin, I would like to thank the members of the America Society, the members of the Council of the Americas, because of your support, we're able to do these programs, and we really thank you. We're also very grateful to NBC Universal for their support of tonight's program. After the panel, we'll be hosting a reception in that room over there, and we encourage you to stay and hang out and talk to the panelists and the other guests. And for those of you who are not yet members, you're welcome to join us and reserve a spot as a member. You can talk to my colleague Holly, who is over here, and she'll talk to you if you don't talk to her. So with that, it is my pleasure to turn things over to Julio to begin tonight's discussion. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for being here. So Julio.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for coming tonight. And I'm really happy to be joined by you, Shannon, Ariane, and Gerónimo. I was hoping we can start by just you describing how you see the relationship between Mexico and the United States right now. It's been described as under stress, but President Trump and President Sheinbaum just had a conversation a few days ago, and President Trump said she's the most wonderful and highly intelligent woman. So how would you describe, Shannon, the present state of the relationship?
An easy question to start off, so thank you. And thank you to the American Society and Council of the Americas for having us all here and doing this. You know, I guess as I look at the U.S.-Mexico relationship today, you know, the good news is you look more broadly around the world, and it's pretty good compared to many other countries, right? And particularly if you look just to the north, to Canada, you know, things have been quite rocky there, and there's many more threats of tariffs and other sorts of things of, you know, banning their planes from the United States and other. So it's, you know, it's much, the temperature is much lower than other places. I think the, you know, Mexican government has managed quite well in that sense. But in that relationship, I think Mexico is facing the challenges that every country around the world has faced, and that this is a very different kind of foreign policy coming out of the United States than we have seen in many years or in many presidencies. And I think as I look at the Trump administration's foreign policy, it is very unilateral. Right? This is the United States for itself. You know, then it's not about multilaterals. We've pulled out of, you know, several dozen multilaterals, but just the approach is very unilateral, and it's one country to one country. So we have that. It's very volatile, right? One day things seem to be going well. The next day, all of a sudden, there's tariffs or there's some other sort of, you know, punishment or sort of cudgel that is threatened on a country. And then finally, it is very transactional. And we will see that too. And I think as we get into, you know, we're 1 year in, and Mexico has managed so far to sort of navigate the various, you know, demands of the U.S. administration. But, you know, 2026 is the year, obviously, which we'll talk about, of USMCA and sort of a real negotiation and decision whether, you know, to keep it, to, you know, go year to year or to renew as it is. So I think we will see a very transactional. And then the last thing I'll say is, you know, for many, many years in U.S.-Mexico relations, there was an effort by both sides to, you know, keep each issue in its own box. So, you know, economics was over here, and water was over here, and environment was over here, and security was over here. And this is a U.S. administration that puts everything in that same box. And we've seen that already. And I think as we get to, you know, commercial negotiations in USMCA, we will see security and rule of law and corruption and water and all other things kind of thrown into that box, which will make it a much more complicated U.S.-Mexico relationship to navigate this coming year.
All right. So it's an important year then, Ariane. What's at stake for Mexico when it comes to negotiating this USMCA this year?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for the Council of Americas for the amazing opportunity to be here today. So, you know, what I will add to what Shannon brilliantly said is that the Mexico and the U.S. relationship is unavoidable. And this will connect to what you just asked me, you know, what's at stake. 2,000-mile border, they almost are in the same house. So even if they want to have a rupture, it's impossible to do that. If they share, you know, the border, there's constant migration, and so the issues that affect Mexico inevitably affect the U.S. So what is at stake for Mexico? Mexico has based its growth economic model on having NAFTA, and it has worked really well for the last 30 years. So, when this first came about, we thought that this would be essentially the end for the economic model for Mexico. But if you think of it, what's at stake really is the removal of a framework that has helped create the incentives for investment to be present in Mexico for a long time. Now, the sad part is that even if there's an agreement in 2026, and the country's able to renew, which is, by the way, Moody's baseline scenario, we assume that there's going to be a renewal, the world has changed. And so it can no longer be assumed that this will be permanent. And so the uncertainty of this not being there will now be there. And so what is at stake for Mexico is, with this uncertainty hanging, even if we don't have or we have an agreement, what kind of conditions do we create for investment to still remain in Mexico, even if we don't have an agreement?
Okay.
So I mean, I can add a lot of that, but I just want that hanging, that we're all fixated with 2026, July, we'll have an agreement, 16 years, we're done. That's no longer the case. So we cannot rule out bilateral agreements between Mexico and the US. We cannot rule out annual reviews. Even if our baseline is a renewal, there's a possibility that in less than 16 years we'll be back discussing this thing.
So I guess if we have to describe the relationship, which was the first question, uncertainty is the answer right now. Ambassador, what's your first take?
Well, first of all, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be in this distinguished panel and obviously among friends. Thank you for the council for inviting me, and thank you especially all of you at the audience for giving us a little bit of your valuable time to listening what we have to say. So I think the relationship, I agree basically with what has been said. I think that the relationship is in a phase which is marked by one thing, which is the tension between economic integration and political difference and sovereignties. That has always been present for some time, but it's clearly exacerbated given the level of economic integration and the level of political differences on different areas. So that's number one. It is volatile, uncertain, active, intense. But I also think, and I'm trying to be positive, that it's a little bit more mature, in the sense that if we would have seen a statement coming out from the White House 20 years ago saying that there is a unholy alliance between organized crime and the Mexican government, there would have been a meltdown in Mexico, and there would have been a meltdown in the relationship. If we suddenly had, 15 years ago, tariffs established as they have been, if we had the president, as we did just, yesterday, the U.S. president celebrating in modern times for the first time the Mexican invasion and what it is an unfair war, the 1848 war, which many people in the United States don't even know that took place. There would have been a meltdown in the relationship, and that is not occurring. So I think there's that tension between economic integration and political differences. There is a lot of volatility. There is also more mature. I would add that it's a high stakes, high risk, high reward scenario for Mexico, I think. President Trump is, whatever you might say about him, he's unpredictable, but he likes getting deals. And it's not impossible that a reasonable deal can be achieved. So I think that's what we're essentially facing now. Now, there's two more elements that I think complement this scenario in the relationship. One is the fact that we do have a new geopolitical scenario that we didn't have when NAFTA was negotiated, we didn't have in the 2008 financial crisis. It's really new. Most experts would say that it's here to stay, and that it's, people are talking about a complete, that there's a new world order, that we have moved completely away from the rule-based order to one of, transactional based. I think, yes, we're moving. I don't know if it'll be permanent. It's never going to be the same. We're not going to be back in the roaring 90s anywhere in the world, and especially not in North America. But I think it's a process. But you do have a new geopolitical, Mexico is going to have to deal. During the Cold War, we had a equilibrium with the United States by which we flirted with the Latin American left. We had a diplomatic activism on the Third War, but that was less important to the United States than the shared objective of keeping socialism out of Mexico. And that equilibrium lasted, I don't know, 34 years, 4 decades. And I think that we're going to find a new, Mexico is going to have to find a new equilibrium, most likely this time with China. And I think that's exactly what is happening. So it's new, but I'm still fairly optimistic.
Okay.
That there's going to be pain, there's going to be compromise in whatever comes next, and dovetailing of what was said by Shannon. What you have, there was an implicit rule in the U.S.-Mexico relation for decades that is trade issues are trade issues, they're dealt separately. Mm-hmm. Security was one thing, migration was the other. This time around, you have sort of what could be labeled as a three-dimension negotiation or circus going on with trade, security, and migration. And if you want to add a little bit more complexity, and I'll promise I'll stop there, you have a Trump 2.0 that is exactly the same as ideology as 8 years ago, but with less counterweights in his cabinet, Congress, and the courts, and wanting to really put his imprint into history. And I think that also makes it a little bit more interesting.
Okay. All right. So it's a lot to really dig in, but let's try and narrow it down. There's the review of the USMCA by July. And there are, correct me if I'm wrong, but 3 possible scenarios. End the USMCA, keep it as it is, and then review it every year. Which one do you think is more possible, Shannon?
High uncertainty, but I don't think it'll be ended, but if I had to guess, I would say year to year.
Year to year.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good.
What about you, Adrian? Which is year to year until 2036.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Or something else comes along the way, but yes.
No, our baseline is that they will renew, and so it's 16 more years after this. But as I said earlier, we do not rule out the possibility of what Shannon is saying.
Okay.
Now, even if, well, I can add a lot of stuff. Go on.
Ambassador?
So, yeah, I would just compliment. I also tend to agree. I think we have basically 2 scenarios. I mean, I agree that he's not going to kill it. I don't think so. I think that the likelihood of that is close to 0. In the end, it's his baby, right? He went from calling NAFTA the worst deal ever to saying USMCA is the best deal ever. I think he'll have a harder problem than last time in just killing it outright. I mean, so far, he has not... President Trump has not signaled with force his intent to withdraw. So I think that is a very low probability scenario. And then you have 2 possibilities, which one is you modify it, and I think it's naive to think it's only a review. It's going to be modified. How much and then through what process is unclear, because there is no trade promotion authority currently on the U.S. So if you make sufficient changes, you're going to have to figure out how you do that, pass that through the U.S. Congress. The Mexican Congress, I don't think will be much a problem. The Canadian Parliament will be a little bit more difficult. So that how do you land those modifications is not clear, and I'm not a trade lawyer, but I think it's important to think about that. So that's one possibility, and the other one is just keep it open. It means that every year, I think that's possible also, because it will provide leverage to President Trump. Although he does like deals, and I think pressure as the midterm selection nears to get a deal on this one might, it needs to be on July. And I'll tell you a story, because I think it's important. The so-called sunset clause really comes out of the fact that initially, and it's no secret, President Trump and his then USTR representative, Ambassador Lighthizer, were not fond of having a permanent trade agreement. They made that public. So the USMCA, the initial discussion was it's going to be 5 years or 10 years. So the commitment in the end, the compromise was we'll have a sunset clause. And the sunset clause is we'll review it, and it's going to be 16 years, and we'll review it. And the truth is that sensible people on both sides at that time thought that the best thing to do was not have it reviewed by potentially Donald Trump again, or by AMLO. And what nobody figured out is what he was going to be out for 4 years and then return. So that is why we have what we have right now.
All right, so what about a bilateral deal? Because Trump officials have talked about the possibility of negotiating one deal with Canada, one deal with Mexico. Is that like a real scenario, Shannon? And would it be good or bad?
Well, I'm looking at the audience and I see people who are real lawyers. I'm just playing one up here, so please correct me afterward. But talking with those in the trade space who do this it's sort of a yes, but. Right? We have seen a whole set of frameworks that have been, signed with the EU, with Vietnam, with Malaysia, with Indonesia. I mean, keep going down the list. And these are real trade frameworks. And the EU one at least has been codified and put into the registry. So that is actually functioning with CBP, but the Customs and Border are sort of implementing those rules at the moment. So that is a path. And if you look back at, both the Biden administration and even the Obama administration, there were some executive trade agreements, so that did not go through the Congress, but that were at the executive level. So there is some sort of path here. I think the real question is, and we were talking about this before, and I'll maybe turn over to Ariane in a minute, but is that, what NAFTA and then USMCA, its real fundamental benefit is being an investment agreement. Right? Yes, it's a trade agreement. Yes, it does tariffs and things, but it's really an investment agreement. And it has all of these chapters. And I think there's a question when you look at sort of the UK, framework, or you look at the EU framework, it has some things, but it is a short piece of paper, right? And it's not hundreds of pages long with all of these different chapters that deal with all of these different aspects of the trading relationship. And if you get to that thick of a book, there's a real question about whether you have to go through Congress. So if all of a sudden you're negotiating a totally different deal, can you really, skate it into an executive trade order versus a congressional one that then has the sort of longevity and permanence, pseudo-permanence, because that's what we're talking about up here, but, has sort of a congressional mandate as well.
Yeah. Ariane?
Yeah, I guess I was trying to de-emphasize the importance of the USMCA because of what Gerónimo said earlier, the mature nature of the relationship and the investment framework. If you think of the genesis of NAFTA, was really a way for Carlos Salinas de Gortari to convince the Americans to come and invest in Mexico, that even if there's a democratic transition and a change of government, and Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, who at the time was really opposing to NAFTA, comes to power, you now have an investment framework to operate. Well, guess what? Now we have the political heirs of that party ruling, and they're fighting with everything they can to maintain this agreement. So what is that telling you? That in Mexico, there's a countrywide consensus to have a very strong relationship with the US and maintain the incentives for Americans to come and invest in Mexico. So even if they don't have the framework in place, you still have the very mature integrated manufacturing supply chains. You have history of investment and different development components across El Bajío and the north of Mexico, so that will remain. Now, I don't want to say that it doesn't matter not having a framework, because on the other hand, you have in Mexico judicial overhaul that, I call it overhaul because a reform tends to think more of it in positive terms. This judicial reform creates a lot of uncertainty on how, if you have to face the law in Mexico, how you're going to resolve disputes. So that's where NAFTA and the USMCA come in relevance for investment decisions. So the real risk, what is really at stake for Mexico, is that in the absence of a trade agreement, what kind of rule of law, what kind of operating environment will investment face in Mexico? Those companies that are already based in Mexico know how to operate in Mexico, will probably keep investing in Mexico. But to attract new investment, to explore areas that have not been developed, that's where that tax becomes harder. So I could add more, Julio, to this, but I think that ultimately the big challenge that Mexico faces is domestic. How is Mexico going to create the conditions to make Mexico attractive for nearshoring or for investment from within and above, regardless of what the U.S. does, is the real challenge for Mexico.
Now, Ambassador, you were talking about how, all three of you have talked about this, how the world has changed. And in this new world order, most countries seem to be trying to diversify and not only look at the U.S., but look at other possible partners. With all those risks that Ariane is mentioning, why is it Mexico looking at other possible deals and it's so focused on the U.S.?
Well, it's an important question. I think, and I don't know, I'm not sure if I have a very good answer, but I'll certainly try. One is, I think that we have always, to some extent, we've always known, especially in NAFTA, that we are heavily dependent on trade and investment from the U.S. I mean, the level of economic integration is very high. The supply chains are there. We have tried or talked about diversification of our economic or political relations, but we always do it when there's a crisis with the U.S. and we don't do it systematically. And it takes 1 or 2 generations really to diversify. So that's so the first question is, even if you have that objective, you have to be serious about that objective and not do it just only when there's a crisis and just talk about it. I think it's much. That's one. 2, we are going to update our strategic agreement with the European Union. I think this year actually. It's a negotiation that's been ongoing, and we have we're essentially one of the most open economies in the world. But I think it just because of geography, logistics, it's just ideally just doesn't make sense to diversify that much. I mean, you can, but it's just the level of entrenchment of the supply chains is just so very hard to change. So decoupling the North American partners, in this case Mexico and the U.S., it's almost as hard, I think, as having the U.S. decouple from China. And I think they're finding out. The U.S. is finding out that, it's not so easy to decouple, or at least so quickly. So I think it's a longer process. That's part of the answer. The other thing is, geopolitically, I think that a lot of people are betting, the new world order, if I may use that term, is not going to be the same as we sort of lived, I would say, essentially to the, from the last 2 decades of this century to, say, the financial crisis of 2009-10, right? It's going to be different. What exactly? But I don't think it's going to be as different as people think it is going to be. And I think that countries are also betting a lot on, is the U.S. in decline? Is it, And I tend to think that it's very difficult to move such a big ship as it is the United States for any one president, even President Trump. So it moves, but it moves slowly. And it might be wishful thinking.
It feels it moves very quickly.
Yeah, it does
especially
feel,
this month.
especially.
I mean, look at
look
at the news.
Yeah, I think media has to do. Don't take it wrong, Julio, but I think media has to do. You're bombarding us every day with all sorts of news. But I think the long-term trend might not be as that different.
Yes.
And so there will be important changes for sure, but running for diversification. I'm not clear that's the right approach for Mexico and other countries.
I feel like
now.
Yeah,
Right?
Here, I don't know, Shannon.
I promise I'll be very brief.
Okay.
So the question is diversify to where and on what, right? To where is Europe? Europe doesn't grow. Mexico already has trade agreements with almost all the rest of the world. You still see their trade structure, 80% goes to the U.S. The U.S. is the biggest, largest market, the biggest consumption market that you have, and it's right there. It's your next door neighbor. So it's like ignoring the huge opportunity that you have right there. So economically, it makes a lot of sense to just keep betting on your neighbor and waiting for it to realize that if it's serious about nearshoring and decoupling from China, Mexico is the best advantage that the U.S. has. And then the other part I said, on what? Mexico produces manufacturing products that are integrated completely with the rest of the production that ends up in the U.S. So to begin that diversification, it's a long way ahead.
Okay.
And what the decisions that Mexican government officials are actually doubling down in that relationship. You've seen tariffs now being imposed in all the countries that they don't have trade agreements, which are essentially China.
Yes. Shannon?
Yeah, so on this question about diversification, so first, in 1980, before NAFTA, 80+% of Mexico's trade that it had went to the United States. So it's never been diversified. It was oil it was spending then. It wasn't manufactured goods. But it was over, yeah, well, it depends which year, but yes, it was over. So you've never diversified. But I think the other challenge for Mexico as you start trying to diversify is, frankly, what does Mexico have to offer, right? Mexico, and we talked, it's not all that productive. It has, more uncertainty around the judicial system, and what it has had to offer really is the U.S. market and access to the U.S. market. And so you start looking around the world, and Mexico is a competitor rather than a complement to China. And I think what's interesting, you look at sort of Mexico's economic history. We talk about a lot here in the United States the China shock after 2001 and China joining the WTO, and the 1 to 2 million jobs lost here in the United States. But per capita, Mexico was hit much harder than the United States in terms of hollowing out manufacturing than the United States was, because they were such a much more of a direct competitor, right? They lost their toy industry, they lost most of their shoe industry, they lost their textile industry, they lost these sort of electronics, fax machines, and all of that. And to Mexico's credit, over the last sort of 15 years, they've built up advanced manufacturing, right? They've built up an automotive industry. They've built up some of a pharma medical device industry. They've built up some electronics and some, aerospace. If you look at sort of the China made in 2025 and this next China, 5-year plan that just is coming out, it is all the industries that Mexico is good at now, and they are going to put a lot of industrial policy behind it. They already are putting a lot. So this is all to, where does Mexico try to diversify? And this is also a China that last year sent $1.2 trillion worth of goods, net goods out, flooding other markets. So Mexico, if it's trying to diversify, is going to be competing with China in Brazil, in Europe, in Southeast Asia, and you name the market. So it's even if they want to, it is a very hard. They are playing against an incredible competitor in this. It's got a hard take. And what they do have vis-a-vis China, especially today, is access to the U.S. market.
I think, just to jump in, I think Shannon is right on point. I think it's where to and with what is not obvious. I think you're absolutely right, and people don't realize that much. But people forget, to your point, Mexico was the last country that voted on the World Trade Organization in 2001 to have China join the World Trade Organization, and it was for a good reason, because we're essentially competitors. So that's one. What I do think, talking about diversification, and just two thoughts sort of to challenge a little bit, which is one, it's clearly going to be more difficult to Mexico. I mean, what Mexico sells is access to the U.S. market and proximity. I mean, I would like to think with many other things, including beaches, but I do think what we do have to assume, and that's the challenge, is that having preferential treatment by the U.S., it's not going to be as easy to get without further political alignment, irrespective of who is in the White House. And I think that's the question. So that's one thing. And the other one is Mexico. We should, Shannon also talk about transactional, right? Well, our foreign and national security policy is very stiff. So if we, in the end, Mexico needs to decide, if we have a very transactional policy, let's transact, right? And when we got into NAFTA, we wanted to be sort of, as least politically aligned from the United States as possible and have all the trade benefits. That is no longer possible. Therefore, is it time to give a further step and align more politically? And I think that's going to be the real question for Mexico. And I know you might ask about this, Julio, but look at what happened with Cuba just these days.
Yes.
And tells you something about what I'm talking about. But
I do want to talk about Cuba, but just before we move to Cuba, I think it's important to go back to that initial point you mentioned, Shannon, where the relationship is no longer divided into issues, but everything comes into the same box. So it's immigration, security, trade. Do we need to see progress in all of those issues at the same time for Trump to agree on a USMCA with Mexico and Canada? Or no? How do you see that?
I mean, we've seen significant, in Trump's view, progress on the immigration side, right? There are very few
Yeah.
people at the border. So that one feels like
So
it's
security
checked,
the
right?
main
So,
issue,
so
no?
security is the main one. I would add corruption to it too,
yeah.
right? That has also been brought up in the conversations with Mexican officials, with U.S. officials. And I do think there needs to be progress. And here the challenge is, I mean, the Sheinbaum administration has been doing what Mexico often does, which is, offering up people to extradite. They've made record, busts of fentanyl and precursors and the like. They've offered up people. They're sort of, going after other sort of high-profile targets. But, the impression I get from the U.S. side is that this time is not enough, right? Sort of the scalps, right? It has to be something more fundamental, and that's very hard to do. We have seen, I would say, a few moves in that sense. You've seen some shuffling of Morena leaders out of the Senate, to those who were accused of significant or tied to people who were seen to be quite corrupt. So I think there is some of that and effort, but the real challenge is the changes the United States wants to see are hard to deliver.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
President Trump has offered to use the U.S. military. To
Indeed, he
fight
has,
protests.
right?
Yes.
And I will let Gerónimo speak about the appetite of the Mexicans to have,
What would be
U.S.
like
troops.
a political impact for Sheinbaum's government if he does that unilaterally?
First of all, I think people. That's on everybody's mind. Are we going to have drones or or something like that, an extraction anytime soon in Mexico? I still think that the probability of that is extremely low. It's not zero, and it's never been as high, but it's still low. I think that there is a lot of work going on, which might not prove sufficient. And I think there are two pending issues that would need to be addressed, or probably will need to be addressed. One is President Sheinbaum's strategy domestically seems to be giving results in terms of some of the basic metrics, So there's hope that it's, a better strategy. Let me just call it a better strategy. And that, but there's a piece missing, which is we have not dealt with an obvious thing and an obvious challenge, which is the infiltration of organized crime into Mexico's political system at very high levels. Is that mean that there is an alliance between, quote unquote, the Mexican government and cartels? No, there is not. At least not systematic, not reaching the president level, in my view, but there is significant infiltration. And dealing with that might prove harder. So the US, and this is just rumor, might be looking not, to break those ties between the political system and organized crime. And that's a hard part. And that's one. And the other one is very specific, which is, are we going to have joint operations or not? I think we're already having them. And we're not saying probably all that much, and that's probably the only way to do it. And I don't think, by the way, that Mexicans are terribly preoccupied with that. We don't have good data, and people that just open that possibility are sometimes labeled as traitors, wrongly, I think, but that's a possibility. The thing is that we don't have a clear, efficient, and strong legal framework to do that now. And I think we should think about it. How does that look? How does those joint operations look? Mm-hmm. And the idea of that would be that the U.S. gets greater certainty on how is cooperation from Mexico going to be, and making sure that it's stable, and Mexico gets hopefully a clear-cut legal limit to what that's going to be. Is that possible? I don't know. But those are the two things that are pending.
What do you think, Shannon?
So can I just add one thing? I think the decision whether or not to say send drones or strike may in the end have nothing to do with what Mexico's doing. I think it may have to do with U.S. domestic politics. And as we go forward, obviously here in the United States, we're looking at midterm elections coming up. It will be hard fought in some parts of the country. There have been some, not great numbers for the Republican Party in Texas most recently in a special election and the like. And I think, I see that if those of you who haven't visited the White House statements recently, there was a statement about, the 1848. And I saw that as written by someone who was very focused on the border in the White House. And kind of playing up those issues a little bit, is the way I read it, right? And so the other thing I would say is, as I look at sort of the threats and actions of the U.S. government over the last, I guess it's only been a month, but you have seen actions where there is sort of a bipartisan consensus that there were bad guys, right? Nobody in the United States really thinks Maduro, or frankly in the region, really thinks Maduro was a great guy, right? I also, the sort of the vocal threats vis-a-vis Cuba, there's few in the United States who also think that sort of the Cuban regime is sort of a good regime. Greenland, on the other side, most people think people in Denmark are quite nice, right? And so I think there's a little bit of pushback and sort of the walk back. Some of that has to do with U.S. domestic politics and support. And I just would say, while there is not bipartisan support for striking Mexico, even before Trump came in, there were some Republicans who were talking about that. So there's a little bit more space for this in the domestic political realm than I think some other things that might be on the table.
It is going to be very much also on the domestic, sorry for jumping in, but this might be wishful thinking, but Mexico's military has developed over the last 2 decades military-to-military relations with the U.S. that are largely under the radar, that are important. I tend to, be more to, have a better opinion about military than, hope that I don't get in trouble, but MAGA crazies. And I think, and I hope that sensible people within the administration will point to there is increased cooperation, don't, give it time to mature. B, that if they do that unilaterally, it will send the relation decades backwards, I think. It'll be a terrible thing, and it will, embolden the Morena hardliners, and it will be very, and more importantly, that there is, I think, fair evidence that those things do not, on the long term, solve the problem. And it's disrupting the markets, disrupting the financial flows. Yes, going after the bad guys, but there's always the analogy. You don't go, if you're going after, you don't go after the CEO. Even if the CEO is there, and the company's there, you're going to have to deal with it.
Now, Ariane, how does security concern affect Mexico ratings, and how? I mean, it sounds like maybe a bad question, because obviously it's important to solve the problem, but how important is it?
It's an excellent question, and I was going to start saying that we agree at Moody's that there will be sympathy, frankly, for, there's still, even within Mexico, support for Trump administration, because there's this sense that there's a clear shift of approach from Claudia Sheinbaum administration versus the previous administration towards crime. I don't know if there's still results. There's a change in approach. There's lower homicide rates, but then higher desaparecidos, right? Disappearances. So, results are still to come. But I would say that then there's the risk that even if there's a chirurgical intervention and removal of a cartel organizer, there might be support for that. But any operation can go wrong. And then Claudia Sheinbaum will have to deal with the backlash of that, and that creates some political risks. But how do we integrate from Moody's ratings the security issues? When you have high levels of security, that's like another tax for investment, right? So all the economic actors have to factor that in, and it becomes also that the big swathes of the country are uninvestable, perhaps because then you have the risk of the cartels taking away your merchandise or just not having safe routes. And so then that creates this problem of investment only in the same places, and the disparity you see across the country continues to be entrenched. So yes, it's in a way, it lowers the potential growth for the country, and it's part of the one of the factors that we take into account for any country when we assess risk. Just one point, connecting to the rest of the region. There's a surge of violence and crime across Latin America. So that is very much connected with this wave of right-wing political leaders that have been elected just recently in Costa Rica as well, precisely because the citizens of Latin America really want this to be addressed, and they're starting to be more open to the idea of Bukele-like leaders. And so I'm putting that into context because in Mexico there's higher tolerance than before for the kind of operations that may not necessarily follow the legal ways, if you will.
Okay. Now I do want to turn to Cuba because Mexico has been sending oil to Cuba, and President Trump signed this this order imposing tariffs to countries that send oil to Cuba. How do you see that relationship playing in, like Mexico, the diplomatic cost of continuing to help Cuba when President Trump is trying to chuckle the island?
I mean, as I saw, Representative Sheinbaum said you can send humanitarian aid, right? And then it was, right, and so trying to pivot. I think this is one actually where the Trump administration will be pretty firm in saying that there isn't going to be energy sent to Cuba. Or there will be tariffs on those who do send to Cuba, right? And now the Trump administration now controls oil coming out of Venezuela through U.S. suppliers and following that. And I think the back down by Mexico this is a real issue. And for Mexico, yes, President Sheinbaum has political coalitions to manage and different views on this, but this could actually be a real threat to USMCA. I'm not sure she's going to choose Cuba over the trade agreement.
No, the government's argument seems to be that a humanitarian crisis in Cuba can be very costly for Mexico, like an immigration crisis in Mexico.
First of all, I think she's made the decision. We stopped the oil first.
Yeah.
It wasn't clean, and the president, to her credit, President Sheinbaum was between a rock and a hard place. But she's taking that decision. I think she squished, if I may use the term, diplomatically, not too openly said, we're not sending it. If you look at what happened, which is really interesting, is they talked on the 29th, they have a good conversation. President Sheinbaum goes out and says, we had a good conversation, we talk about trade and other things, we didn't talk about Cuba. A gaggle from the president the next day at Air Force One goes out and says, oh, I had a great conversation with President Sheinbaum. She's great. I told her I didn't want Mexico to send oil to Cuba, and she's not sending. So, sort of pulled the rug out of President Sheinbaum. But to President Sheinbaum's credit, I think she took the right decision. It's hard, not so much, in addition to the humanitarian, because of political affinity. But in the end, it's, as it happened in Venezuela, it's getting harder to, sustain what's happening in Cuba. And it's getting harder for any progressive government from Latin America, from the left and from the right, to say, we need to do something. And I think that's why she chose to stop the oil. And I think that behind the sort of the scrimmages of the last week, what she's trying to do, and it might work, is she's trying to play the mediator role. Mm-hmm. We have done a little bit of that in the past with the U.S. So I think, and if you see some of her statements point to that fact, I think what she's telling President Trump is, okay, I won't send the oil, but we have to deal with the humanitarian. People are really hurting there, and they are. And let me help you get something going, and let's think about the people. And President Trump in that gaggle actually went out. This is a speculation, but actually goes out and says, oh, yes, we're going to talk to the Cubans, and we'll probably get a deal. So there's something going on that might not turn that bad.
Yes.
Just will add that Mexico is a net importer of oil, right? And it subsidizes, it's sending a point of GDP more or less net terms to Pemex, which is completely in debt and would be not a viable company if it wasn't for the support. So this, sending oil to Cuba in this context, economically,
yes.
It's a difficult decision.
Doesn't make much sense.
Financial.
Now, let me move on because I do want to leave some time for the audience to ask questions. But in the middle of all this, we have the World Cup coming up, which is probably the most important thing that's taking place. No, but seriously, is that an opportunity for unity, like for coming together and maybe setting the tone in the midst of the USMCA negotiations? Shannon, do you see that happening or not at all?
Well, I hear they're going to be fast-track visas for people if you have World Cup tickets.
Yes.
So I guess that is a way of coming together.
And that's it, and nothing much.
I think I'll leave it at that.
Do you see that, Ambassador, like setting a positive tone, unifying the
It helps
continent?
the atmospherics to sort of, in the end, President Sheinbaum only met with President Trump in DC at the Kennedy Center in the context of a World Cup event. They had not met, they had spoken very times, but they couldn't meet in Canada. So it helps. I mean, let me be a bit, a little bit silly, but it's harder to bum a neighbor when there's about to be
Yes.
a soccer match. I mean, it's a little bit harder. I'm not saying it, but there's business coming out of the World Cup for everybody. So I do think it helps, but not that much.
Okay.
So I wouldn't bet absolutely on it.
Ariane, what's your take?
I mean, it would also add a spotlight to all the problems and all the difficulties between the three regions.
All right.
And it can create problems also with all the immigration. So, but I don't think it would benefit the USMCA. We would just separate lanes.
Okay. Let me finish with this. Maybe take a step back and look at the changes in foreign policy and the relationship that the U.S. has had with Mexico in the past year, and the approach that Mexico has had to the U.S. in the past year. If you look at it from above, how permanent do you think these changes are going to be? Ambassador, you were very optimistic about it at the beginning. I don't know if all of you agree, or if this is like it's going to have a bigger, more permanent impact, especially the relationship that Trump has decided to have with Mexico. Shannon?
You look through U.S. history, and we have our ups and downs. There are times when we want to engage with the rest of the world, and there are times when we want to pull back. And particularly when you look at the history of the U.S. with the Western Hemisphere, I think the last 25, 30 years, we've actually been less heavy-handed, perhaps less unilateral than we were for the 100 years before that. So we might be kind of returning back to the norm versus sort of breaking with tradition. It's a tradition that we all know, but you look on a little bit of a longer time. I think where it becomes more lasting, right? We could see we will see a new president in a few years, and that might, whatever that flavor of that person, they will be a different person. They will have a different way of working, and they may have they may have different choices in terms of policies, but they will most likely have a different style, perhaps. And so you could say, well, we're going to go back to norm. But I think the issue here, and we've talked a bit about it up here, is that every action has a reaction. I think I learned that in physics in high school. But it does, and I think you're already starting to see other nations all around the world have reactions to the U.S. And we've talking a bit about sort of supply chains and the like. You already are seeing in 1 year. Last year global trade was up 5.56%, but it was down in North America, right? So the world is already starting to rewire. Another 3 years of that, and we're seeing, the EU negotiating with India, negotiating with Mercosur, negotiating with Malaysia, negotiating with Mexico, modernizing that agreement. There's a whole lot of movement that's happening that, fast forward 3 years, those reactions will already sort of reset a little bit the table in a way. So I think some of these, maybe the U.S. will come back in ways that, some of us here in the room might want, or this sort of approach, but I do think there will be fundamental changes, whether it's Mexico or whether it's just a broader foreign policy environment that the next U.S. president and administration will have to work within.
Ariane?
Just briefly, you're asking what will be permanent, right, through the next years. I say the first thing that I think is permanent now is the constant change and the unpredictability of the rules of the game until we have a new global order. So all these investment decisions, and I would say actually that markets have been quite resilient and able to adapt to this unpredictable world, and still, there's no crisis, right? There's no economic crisis. So that's on the hopeful side. The other thing permanent from the Mexico side is this, what I was mentioning earlier, this country-wide consensus that the U.S. relationship it's important, and that they want to fight to keep it as strong as they can. So that's a positive thing, regardless of not having USMCA, which, by the way, our baseline is that it will be renewed. The other thing that it's permanent is, I think, from the U.S. side, this shift for what they call the reshoring. So when you think of what is going to be on the table, and we didn't really address that, is rules of origin, so more U.S. content, less China content in what comes into the U.S. From USMCA perspective, energy security. So even if we have a different government, a different administration, we would see the U.S. trying to strengthen its manufacturing in domestic production. And so that decision leads me to the other permanent thing, which is geography, right? It's unavoidable, this relationship. Even if they don't want to have a strong relationship, they have to, because of all the different issues that we discussed: immigration, security, trade. And so these relationships have to stay permanent. And so then the challenge for Mexico is, with all these permanent things that we discussed, how do I make the most out of this relationship and create the opportunities for investment not over within? And I want to mention a point that I wanted to make earlier. You know, where does Mexico diversify? It can't really diversify. The other way it can diversify is to strengthen its own domestic economy. Mexico has been completely relying on exports as their engine of growth. And when you see other big emerging market economies like India and Brazil, which are more resilient and less susceptible to the different changes of administration, it is because they have a large domestic resilient economy, which Mexico at this point still does not have.
I was just thinking that I'm going to stay on the Winston Churchill camp and say that I still believe the United States will always do what is right after it has exhausted all other options. We should get that. I hope they get the diagnosis right. I think that the average American feels, and perhaps rightly to some extent, that this process that has marked the world the last 4 decades, which is globalization, has been unfair to the United States and unfair to Americans. And that is manifested in every single poll that you can look at. And I think that's partly because this world order that is evolving was led by the United States, using trade and investment as a tool for peace. And I think that was the right approach. And I do think that many countries abuse that leadership. And you see it in the international fora. Every country wants access to the US market. But some of them want to also go into the UN forum and call America a bad name and poke at the US. And that is over for sure. And it's going to be over for quite some time. And maybe rightly so. So there are going to be fundamental changes, but I don't think that it will completely shake out the foreign policy of the United States to the extent that it becomes fully, and I hope not, certainly, because it would be a terrible thing to become as isolated as it was in some points. Now, for Mexico, I do think, if you see Trump's national security strategy in the Western Hemisphere, Mexico has to think seriously about what that implies, because the U.S. is, and I think that will remain, it wants to exert, again, more influence in the hemisphere, and it just makes sense. How it does that is going to be important, and I think that it's going to be important in Mexico. How does it decide to play that card in the future? I don't think that debate, right now we're sort of at the very immediate challenges of USMCA and very specific security issues. We need to start looking at that, and I think that debate has not really taken place in Mexico.
Okay. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, first of all, for all the information you shared. And my question, there was like a talk before that most of, or many of Chinese car production were planning to move to Mexico. So it stopped. And another question, so now that the borders is kind of controlled and we don't have a lot of people passing, does Mexican government share people who came to Mexico? Because it happened from my personal experience. I go with taxi drivers and I ask them, where are you from? Some are from Russia, some from Iran. And I ask them, how did you get here? And they tell me through Mexico. So did you ever share the people who, for the past years when the borders were loose, the names who went there?
It's a very important question, So first on the auto industry, I'm not an expert, but I'll tell you two things. The main challenge for Mexico is that now Chinese companies own 25% of the Mexican auto market. So that's one. And the companies in Mexico are really North American companies. They're not only Mexicans, they're really, it's the GMs, the Fords, they're really North American companies, that's one. There has been concern over the years, and especially in the last years, whether Chinese were going to build these huge, factories in Mexico to build cars and, get the benefits and export them. I don't see that happening, and the numbers are actually, the number of foreign direct Chinese investment in Mexico has grown a lot, but it's still very small. And with everything happening, it's going to be harder. So I don't see that as obviously there's going to be a debate about rules of origin in the review of USMCA, and it's going to be very important. But that, as we speak, is being addressed, I think. On the second part of your question, so there has been times when Mexico did share information from its immigration systems, from SIOM, 1. 2, there has always been concern in the States about someone coming through Mexico to harm the United States. There have been, over the years, lots of stories. To my knowledge, none of them, at least as they were portrayed, fully confirmed or confirmed. Can that happen? Yes, it can, by all means, and Mexico should treat it seriously. And that is why it's so important, the security cooperation, because in the end, it's about establishing a perimeter. Now, the only thing that you're right in the sense that the number of people that cross the border right now, sort of the proxy is migrant encounters at the U.S., at the U.S. southern border, which is at historically low levels for many reasons, including President Trump's policy. What I regret, that's my personal opinion, that had been coming for many years. It was impossible for Mexico to just let that happen, look the other way, and expect that there was not going to be a reaction. We had the reaction since the Trump first administration. And the real question right now is, and the only thing that I regret is we should have done it earlier because we didn't get anything in exchange. Mexico should seek, I think, to get better access and visas and work, temporary work permits in exchange precisely of tightening, our perimeter security in a way that we know who is coming into North America, how they do, and exchange that information.
Shannon, you have something to say about that?
Let me just say just a couple of words on the auto investments. And so there's sort of two things here. One is what Gerónimo was talking about, where sort of, you've seen such an increase in imports from China. They've gone from, now you have a deficit of $140 billion, 100 something.
20% of Mexican imports come from the U.S., from China.
From China, yeah, exactly. So partly it is to protect the Mexican auto industry, but there's a few particular things happening there. One is part of that investment were Chinese suppliers for Tesla, because the Tesla plant in China is twice as productive as any plant in the United States that Tesla has. And when Tesla's sales have gone down, they decided not to build that plant in northern Mexico, and so none of those suppliers came through. The other side was BYD, and BYD had two pressures. One is the United States said, no connected cars were going to go to the United States, so there wasn't an export market. And China put on laws that BYD was not allowed to place their technology and the making of their technology outside of China. And this is part of their, industrial policy that they want to keep all that there. So Brazil is dealing with this challenge right now. They have kits that are going that are BYD kits, but it's basically just an assembly. Mexico didn't want that, and so that is part of the pullback. So the pullback was both Mexico making it less friendly and worried about sort of, China coming into the U.S., but partly it's sort of the business decisions of those two particular Chinese EV makers.
I have
Can I
two
say something
things.
very quickly? Sorry. Just to clarify one thing. Sorry, pardon. I don't think Mexico should restrict this trade with China, to be sure. But the problem, I think, and it's not only reflects in Mexico, is that I think that there has been a growing perception that they have not played by the rules. And the line between public and private enterprises there is completely blurred and makes a difference, just to clarify.
Super quick points. Counterfeit. So 2 ways. Mexico, in anticipation that China was going to be a contentious issue, has put harder custom rules to be able to get all the things that were being smuggled from China to Mexico, and have also increased the custom tax. So that's been a huge revenue, well, not huge, but a meaningful revenue increase for the government, and now they want to have that permanent. And the other thing is what I mentioned, the 30% increase in tariffs. So making the cost to import is a deterrent. I would be also expecting that any strategic decision of investment from a Chinese owner would be turned away, which is also happening in other countries, not only in Mexico, in the rest of the hemisphere.
All right. I don't know if we have more time. One more question here.
Yeah, hi. So I'm coming at this after nearly almost 35 years with Mexico, but from Europe, but being an American. Because I did all my graduate studies in Europe, and Mexico came into my life right at the beginning in Europe. And I've worked 10 years in the Mexican government. And more recently, with Trump coming in, I considered maybe for the first time I'll think about approaching the White House and working and seeing what I could do because I have American citizenship, what can I do to enhance the relationship or contribute to the relationship between Mexico, Latin America, and the US. And then I made the decision where I'm gonna just observe. So I stepped back, and I'm here in New York doing that. So the question is, let's try to I'm interested in your perspectives and insights on what's really going on in Trump's head.
That's a tough one.
Does he, in terms of the reality and the evolution of economic integration, the synergies, the experiences, like what's the reality? Does he understand just how codependent, in a positive way, between Mexico and the US? Like, what's your thoughts on what he is really thinking about?
Ariane?
No, I have absolute no idea, and I would not want to adventure myself going there. But we had a conversation earlier when we were planning for this about how Mexico matters, and I feel like maybe you should make that comment if that's okay.
Yeah, I'll say, what's going on in Trump's head, that's a place that I have not inhabited. But I will say I look at what he's said over years and years and years, and he loves tariffs. He always has since the 1980s, and this is a tool to get anything that he wants. And I know from talking with particularly people who were in his first administration when USMCA was going down that they really had to drag him over the finish line with USMCA. He doesn't think this is his agreement. It was a full court press to get him to sign on. So I think I don't think he has there's no love lost with this agreement. But what we were talking about at a different time, just to take a step back, is we're here and we're talking. This is really important for Mexico, right? As Gerónimo said, Mexico's economy, 2/3 of the economy is of trade is to GDP. It's a huge part of what they do. Is there isn't consumption growth, there isn't any growth. Exports are its only growth. But that is not the United States, right? So while Mexico, 80+% goes to the United States, Mexico is the United States' greatest trading partner, but it's only 17% of what comes into the United States. And while trade as a percent of GDP for Mexico is 67%, for the United States is only 25%. So this is a huge economy, a $30 trillion economy that is very closed and doesn't actually depend on trade. And where it does depend on trade, it doesn't really depend on Mexico, not at least in this sort of, there's just such an asymmetry here that, one, I don't think Trump is thinking at all about Mexico, frankly. He may be thinking about migration, he may be thinking about things like that, right? But the larger economy, are there parts of the US economy that will be hurt incredibly if, USMCA goes away? Are there particular companies that will be hit? For sure. But overall, there are so many other things happening in the U.S. economy that I think it's just not sort of front of mind of lots of people. Some members of Congress, sure it is, but others not. And then the last thing I will say is, for good or bad, what has been driving the U.S. economy has been this huge investment in data centers and the like, which is a very domestic set of investments today. Now, we could talk about in another panel if that's a bubble or not and what that's going to mean. But for right now, it's sort of washing away the fact that manufacturing is down, the fact that these other things are down. So short answer is I don't think he's thinking about it.
All right. Wow. We started very optimistic and then...
No, to end on a positive note, even though there's this asymmetry of relationship, an unstable Mexico creates big problems for the U.S.
Okay. Time's running out, so thank you so much. Thank you very much, Shannon, Ariane, Gerónimo. Thank you.